Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's part 2 of our usual Q&A series, this time for July 2020. So, as we talked about in the last episode, it's kind of like the end of the month. You get this little Q&A series. We get through all the YouTube questions, a few Patreon questions coming up in part 3, which will be on the channel soon. And of course, if you missed part 1 as well, go back, check that one out, because we tried out a few interesting things. We did a rapid fire round, so we're going to give that a shot in this episode as well. Second rapid fire round, spice things up a little bit. And yeah, of course, Monitor Steve is back. We've still got the restrictions around here that prevent us from speaking in person, but this is pretty much as good, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Social distance monitoring Steve, Monitor Steve. It really enjoy. I actually have a serious question, Tim.
Yep.
First of all, what monitor is Monitor Steve on this month? And is there a box involved?
So there is a box involved. We're still going with the Asus Tough Gaming VG279QM, I believe. It's the 1080p 280Hz monitor, the same one from last month. And yeah, we're still using the Corsair power supply box because the level of height adjustment on this monitor isn't quite enough for your tall body. So we're going with this setup, and it worked last time, so I think it'll be good for this one as well. It is also got a little G-Sync sticker here, so maybe you're an NVIDIA shill as well. So,
well, we like to get as many of those things in as we can.
Yep.
A few RTX boxes in the background.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. I can picture it now, so we can continue with part 2. Let's get into it. Is there a reason to buy MSI B550 Tomahawk as Asus X570 Tough Gaming Plus is basically the same price and offers overall more features that come with X570 chipset? I know that Tomahawk has better VRM cooling, but is it really worth it? Well, I think the Tomahawk is technically a better board in terms of quality, build quality, and even features. I know you've said that the X570 board has more features, but I don't think that's actually true. So, as you pointed out, though, you do get better VRM cooling and just an actual better VRM with the B550 board, so that's a plus. Both boards are excellent in terms of VRM quality, so I wouldn't let that sway you one way or the other. But the newer B550 board, with the cheaper chipset, but obviously the same price, they can afford to add a few additional features. So MSI has been able to throw in 2.5 gigabit LAN. I believe you get a slightly better onboard audio solution. Only maybe a very slightly better one, but it is an improvement. You also get USB 3.2 Type-C as a front header, so if your case has that, you can plug that in. That's kind of neat. I'm pretty certain the Asus board doesn't offer that. But then, of course, you do miss the feature that you're probably alluding to that you miss is the PCI Express 4.0 chipset support. So for your secondary PCI Express x16 slot, as well as any M.2, any additional M.2 storage, which, honestly, I think for the vast majority of you, that is going to be completely meaningless, and maybe features such as slightly better audio, faster networking, front USB, improved support. I think that's probably going to be more beneficial because all B550 boards, you get PCI Express 4.0 for your primary graphics slot, which at the moment doesn't really mean anything, but maybe it will in the future. And if you want to take advantage of high-speed storage, you can still do that from your primary M.2 slot because that will support PCI Express 4.0 linked directly to the CPU. So unless for some reason you need 2 PCI Express 4.0 SSDs and maybe some kind of PCI device expansion card that requires 4.0, which I can't really think of any that do right now, then it would make sense to buy the Tough. But basically, they're 2 good motherboards at the same price. I don't think you can go too wrong with either option. I haven't really analysed this right down to the last little thing, but I have a feeling that maybe I'd go with the B550 board, just because, of the things just mentioned. Anything to add to that one, Tim?
No, I think you covered that one pretty well, motherboard expert man.
Well, yeah, thank you. All right, next one. In your opinion, does Intel's big.LITTLE design have any relevance for the desktop? I think we talked about this in last month's Q&A, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think the Lakefield chips had just sort of started to come to the market at that point, and people were very interested in the approach. I don't think it has much relevance for the desktop, to be honest. It's more about pairing like a high-performance, high-power core with low-performance, low-power cores, which makes sense in a mobile design where you're really, you've got a lot of focus on watts and power consumption, whereas on a desktop, I don't really see the need for low power cores. Like, when would you think an Atom core you'd ever want to actually use that on a desktop? Like, for background tasks, you could just use one of your 8 or 6 core CPU cores to do it. It doesn't seem that important.
Yeah, it'd surely be only very niche use cases, like a really small home theater PC NUC type device where it could be useful. But yeah, I don't think so. All right, this looks like another sort of Tim-related question here, displays and DLSS and all that stuff Tim likes to talk about. Is there any use for DLSS on 1080p display, apart from Control, which is the only game I know of that allows to upscale from 540p to 1080p? So, is there any use for DLSS on a 1080p display?
Well, based on sort of the testing I did with games like Wolfenstein, we've got the new, Death Stranding as well, I believe uses DLSS 2.0. It appears to be effective at 1080p. Not as good as it is at the higher resolutions like 1440 or 4K, obviously because you're trying to reconstruct an image from an even lower resolution, so the lower you go, the less data there is to reconstruct up from. But it does still seem to work on a 1080p display, so it's not like you should discount it or anything like that. Assuming we're talking about DLSS 2.0 here, on 1.0 it was particularly bad at 1080p, so Battlefield 5 probably wouldn't be using it, but certainly for new games, from what I've been able to see, basically every resolution is effective. So it's pretty impressive technology in that sense, not just restricted to 4K or high resolution displays. So yeah, Nvidia's done a pretty decent job, I'd say, with the new version.
I would like to ask for your insight, opinions, speculations, Tim, etc., on why Intel is struggling to produce 10nm and 7nm chips, while TSMC chugs along with 7nm and is now even moving towards 5nm.
Hard one to answer, and I'm sure if Intel
if you can answer
they'd be very happy with themselves on that one.
Yeah. If you do have the answers and the fixes for them, you could probably get employed for quite a large sum of money.
Yeah, it could be a future career.
It seems like Intel was just really aggressive on what they wanted to achieve, particularly with 10nm. Weren't able to achieve it, and we don't know all the ins and outs and all the technical aspects of it to really answer the question properly. It is a bit of a mystery.
It seems like there's some flow-on effects there from, as you say, going with really aggressive 10nm targets. I mean, they've been leading with their process technology for so long, right up until 14nm, which, even today, 14nm is reasonably competitive, and it came out, like 5 years ago? 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. So, they've had a lead for a while, and it just seems like there's been maybe some mismanagement along the way, maybe definitely engineering challenges, while TSMC has just been able to steadily iterate on their technology, maybe they set a few more realistic goals that were easier to achieve. Maybe they're trying to hit a few more intermediary steps rather than trying to do as large of a jump. It's probably a combination of all those different things. And, TSMC as well, they kind of would have had a backs to the wall mentality, coming as an underdog and being, having inferior fab technology for all that time, so that, they need to continue to push and up their game with every step. So Intel being in a leadership position, maybe they thought, we can fix these problems with 10nm down the track. We still have 14nm, which is still good, still competitive now. We'll solve those problems. And then, that sort of thinking creeps in and they start having more and more setbacks, and it just starts to snowball for them, like what seems to have happened there. I think they're too big of a company to continue to have fab issues forever, but maybe they won't have maybe they'll never return to the leadership position that they once had. Especially with the news of the 7nm struggles. So, it's been a really interesting shift in the market that way, and just goes to show that, companies that lag behind, like a TSMC or even an AMD with their chips, can, overcome some challenges over time and return to being in a position of winning. So, anything's possible. Would it be sensible to assume that in the absence of a healthy competition provided by Intel, that AMD might rest on its laurels and adopt a more anti-consumer approach, e.g. higher prices, less innovation? So I don't think a higher price or less innovation is necessarily anti-consumer. That would be more, paying OEMs to use AMD chips instead of Intel chips and stuff like that. But again, they're a company, so it's possible that they will not be trying to be as a value option as they once were. Maybe, trying to get more margin out of their products or something like that. That's very possible. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, they certainly won't have to be as aggressive, and they seem like they are a little more focused now on improving margins and becoming more profitable because they're company. So that makes sense. I'm hoping, really hoping that they've learnt some lessons by watching what's happened with Intel, and less innovation isn't a path they're looking to take. And that doesn't seem like something AMD would do, but higher prices, sure. I don't think they'd jack them up like crazy. I think for at least the next few years, even with this news with Intel struggling with 7 nanometers, I think AMD will still be going pretty hard, trying to recapture as much market share as possible. They've still got a long way to go, not so much in the technology front, but with companies like Dell, for example, HP, all those brands getting in there. A lot of work to be done there. So I think they'll be aggressively pursuing that over the next few years. And yeah, Intel is down and out. Well, I shouldn't say down and out because that doesn't really cover it properly, but they're struggling, and they will be continuing to struggle more and more over the next few years, but they can come back, just as we saw with AMD. So I'd say AMD's aware of that. They were pushing hard, and then if Intel does make a comeback in 4 or 5 years, whenever it may be, then things will heat up again, and AMD better not have taken their foot off the pedal there, or Intel will come back very quickly on them. So I'd say they're aware of all of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a really key point, that especially on getting into those OEMs like Dell and stuff, because while for us PC builders, enthusiasts, it seems like AMD's just got this clear win right now, especially in terms of value, mid-range parts, entry level, with Ryzen 3000, and looks to be, taking it a step further with Zen 3 that's coming soon. They are far from winning the other markets. They're just getting started with competitive mobile products, for example, which is a huge market for Intel and seems to be making most of their money right now. And even in servers, having Epic has been quite competitive for a while now, and they're only just inching up in terms of market share in servers. So I agree. I don't think that we'll see too much change in the short term, as AMD will continue to sort of push all that stuff as hard as possible, to sort of expand their market and mind share beyond enthusiasts into mainstream consumers, everyday buyers, server people, all that sort of thing. It's going to take a lot of time, and I guess with these struggles, it's a good time for AMD to capitalize on all of that. All right, so this next question is something that we talked a little bit about in the live stream that we just did earlier today. How much difference in performance would you be satisfied with when comparing next-gen CPUs and GPUs to their previous gen, and has this changed over the years? So, Steve, I think you've brought up a community poll that we've done a little while ago on this. Yes.
Well, before we answer that, maybe because they're sort of asking us what we would be satisfied with, and has that changed over the years? So maybe we'll do that first, and then we'll actually bring up what apparently the community says. So I think for me, if we're talking obviously the same price, and we'll sort of go the mid-range, because as you go higher up, it gets a bit wish-washy. You're paying sort of way too much money there, diminishing returns and all that. I think for it to be a noticeable gain, around 40%, I think. 50% ideally.
Yeah, I think that's what I would need to justify an upgrade. So if you're talking, if I'm not upgrading every generation, I mean, I'm not someone that probably would upgrade every generation. So if we're saying I'm interested in upgrading every 2 to 3 years, so maybe every 1 or 2 generations, then I probably would want 50% performance. So if you then extrapolate that down to each generation, you'd need like 20 to 30% per generation to sort of satisfy that, wouldn't you?
That's the other thing, the time factor there. So hypothetical, unrealistic scenario, what if you were saying 40% every year? So that's huge, obviously. So that if you did it every 2 years, that would be huge. Would that prompt you to upgrade every year, or would you wait for that 80% massive insane boost every 2 years?
Oh, that's an interesting curveball. I'm not sure. I mean, it would kind of change the whole context of the market, wouldn't it? Because now you're expecting a different thing. So, yeah.
I guess you'd still just go every... I get... It's kind of a silly question because it depends on the rate of game development and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, I'll go and have a look at what the community said. So as for how often do you typically upgrade? So the vast majority of people, 50% of people, said they just upgrade when they can get an acceptable performance gain for the same money. So that's, I think that's fair to say. 24% of people said 4 years or more.
Which is quite long, surprisingly, yeah.
Yeah, only 3% upgrade every 15% upgrade every 3 years. I guess it just, whatever's available, they grab it in 3 years' time. 8% for 2 years, 2% yearly. So my yearly thing, obviously not many people bother doing that. And then the other poll we did, which was quite interesting, was how much of a performance increase does a new GPU have to offer? And we're mostly talking about GPUs here, not CPUs. So how much performance increase does the GPU have to offer in order for you to pull the trigger on the upgrade? The majority went with 50%, and that was 41% of all people that voted. And there was, 51,000 people voted.
Yep.
So 40% of those people said they want a 50% gain. 26% people said they want a 60% or better gain. And then going the other way, 20% said 40%, and then 10% said 30%, and then 3% said 20%. So it looks like...
So people want big gains.
Basically, people... Combining these two polls, the time thing is somewhat irrelevant. It's more they want a 50% gain, and that will prompt them to upgrade. But I'd say if you were guaranteed a 50% gain, it'd be like every 2 to 3 years. People would be going in for that by the sounds of it.
Yeah, so if you talk standard sort of cadences, 2 to 3 years, 50% upgrade. These days, what are we getting? A new generation every 2 years? So you're sort of looking at 1 to 2 generations. Let's say 2 generations. So you're kind of doing every second generation of an upgrade. That does mean that every generation needs to be roughly hitting that sort of 20 to 30% per generation to get 50% over 2 generations.
Generally, the way it goes is you get a little bit, a big bit.
Yeah, so maybe...
something along those lines.
Yeah, I think that's very fair to say. So that's kind of what, would be expecting to see. And it is what we used to see, at least prior to the past couple of generations where the price situation kind of got all messed up and, performance was increasing, with something like Turing versus Pascal at the high end, TI, 2080 Ti, 1080 Ti, we did see 25 to 30% performance per generation, which is right on what we wanted to see, what we've just been talking about. But then the price also went from $700 to $1,200 US. So that kind of throws that out.
Back in the good old days, it was just no shrink, and that's why we got big performance gain. And then we I think it was around 28 nanometer, was it? Somewhere around there.
Really slowed down, yeah.
Really slowed down, and then, it's just gotten progressively slower as we've gone on. So, it was sort of the 28 nanometer
it's an interesting discussion because, it certainly will be interesting to see what's hit with this next upcoming generation, to see whether, for those people that have waited 2 to 3 years and are waiting for that 50% upgrade over something like Pascal, whether they will be getting it. Will someone with a 1070 be seeing 50% more performance from a 3070? Be interesting to see what happens there, because they definitely didn't get it with Turing, so we'll see.
All right, next one here. Do you think it's possible to have a second graphics card that handles ray tracing only? Ray tracing has proven to be difficult to render on a single GPU. I know they've tried something similar in the past with physics, but that was kind of a failure. I think ray tracing dedicated cards would be kind of a failure as well, because
too much bandwidth to go between the GPU and the ray tracing card.
Well, not even talking about the practical application of it, but just people generally don't want to buy multiple different cards. First of all, you've got to look at the incentives. So limited sets of games that support it, how impactful the visuals are, and the ray tracing effects will vary depending on the game. So probably the incentive there for a lot of people to do it isn't that high, and it won't for a lot of the super popular games like your Fortnites, pretty much all of those battle royale type games. League of Legends, Dota, all those kind of games. You don't want ray tracing in those games. If it supports them, you'd be turning it off, because CSGO is another example. You don't want that. You don't want ray tracing in your competitive settings, so it'd definitely be turned off. So it has nothing to offer those super popular games that a lot of people play. So Yeah, I don't see people shelling out for a second card. And they're not going to be cheap. There's no way they'd be cheap.
Yeah, that's
it
right.
Wouldn't be something you just buy just for the hell of it and chuck it in there. So, yeah, I don't see it being a thing.
Next question. Hi, guys. Could you explain the difference between GPU and CPU throttling/bottlenecking? Why is a CPU doing this while not even near, let's say, 60% load? So, what do you have to say about this one, Steve?
I'm trying to wrap my brain around it. So, why is the CPU throttling at only 60% load? I don't think it would be. I think the CPU is only at 60% load because the GPU is probably at 100% load and the CPU doesn't need to be at 100% load, or the game is unable to utilize all cores and threads and therefore some are sitting there idle. It's too much of a complicated sort of subject to answer in simplistic terms. But basically, there's games like StarCraft 2 or any of those city building games. They're all good examples of games that are often thought to be very CPU intensive. And while they are in a sense, they're not really. They're only programmed to use one or two cores. So they absolutely smash those cores as hard as they possibly can while the others sit mostly idle. So while it is a CPU-limited game, it's not fully utilizing the CPU. So it's more that the software's the limiting factor, not so much the hardware, which is why in those instances, gamers go for very high-clocked Intel CPUs because they're the best way to alleviate that particular software bottleneck.
Yep.
But as for the CPU, GPU throttling, totally different subject to CPU, GPU bottlenecking. I mean... Kind of. I mean, by throttling, they will be probably creating a bottleneck, but it's two different things, and we don't have enough time to probably explain them all, that we're not making the issue more complicated than it probably already is.
All right, so like in part one, we attempted a bit of a rapid fire round. We've got another suite of questions to ask rapid fire part two for this part two of the Q&A, and yeah, hopefully Steve will get the picture straight away on this one and go with the quick answers. So let's give it a try, second time round. So, Steve, do you drive a vehicle? And if so, what brand and model of vehicle? I think this is upvoted quite heavily.
I have a horse and cart. No, I do drive a vehicle. I have a really exciting Volkswagen Passat. It's an all-track, though. I use it for going fishing, so and sometimes for just vehicling in general. Tim, now that Microsoft and Sony have shown their next-gen game lineup, are there any games in particular that catch your eyes?
There's a few that excite me, like Horizon 2 for PS5, but probably not as many PC, Microsoft, Xbox games at the moment. I'd like to see a few more of those. Okay. Steve, what are a bunch of utility programs to stick on a USB stick for quick benchmarks and quality testing?
I guess stuff like... we don't use this, but we do for on-screen stuff. MSI Afterburner, that's a handy tool with Riva Tuner. Generally, they sort of come packaged together. Hardware info. That's all I can think of off the top of my head. All right, next one here, Tim. Will we see a sudden specs requirement bump on PC games when ports from next-gen consoles arrive?
Wouldn't think in the short term as there's sort of a console transition. Probably a few years down the track, yes, but yeah, not initially. Steve, how long will the Pascal cards hold on after the next-gen consoles are released?
5 minutes. No, honestly, I don't know. We'll just have to get benchmarking them to find out. Tim, how will consoles affect GPU pricing?
Probably will force stuff to come down in price, I would think, over time. But again, very hard to say on the short term on that one. Steve, got a motherboard one for you here. Would you recommend the B450M Mortar Max or the B450 Tomahawk Max from MSI? Those are two different form factors, aren't they? Yeah,
it depends on whether you want micro ATX or ATX. I haven't done much testing or any with the Mortar, so I'd just have to recommend the Tomahawk because it's the board we've tested extensively. But I think they're both good boards. Tim, why are there basically no OLED monitors out there?
Difficult one to answer quickly. I think it's too expensive. LG's not making their technology in sort of the more affordable price points, and the burn-in risk is also a factor. So yeah, that's that one.
All right, once again, we're going to hit pause. Well, that really actually concludes the community tab portion of our Q&A, because we will be doing Patreon questions in part 3, which will be on the channel the next day or two. But yeah, done with this one. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, really good questions this month. I mean, we always say there's good questions. Maybe we're lying on one of the months and actually there were terrible questions that month. But this month,
we do pick
really
them.
good.
We do pick them.
We do pick them. We do a bit of curation. But yeah, I think that this month there was a lot of similar questions about things like around the console launches, which is obviously very exciting for people coming up, you know, new GPU launches, that sort of thing. So hopefully even if your question wasn't answered, we answered a very similar question because, you know, we're not going to go through and speak about the same thing 3 or 4 times, but yeah, certainly some interesting topics to get through. So yeah, if you're not a Patreon member, always a good time to sign up. You are a 20% club at this point. If assuming you watched the whole video, you didn't cheat, you have actually got to the end.
You might as well be a Patreon member if you're part of the 20% club. Like,
get on it. You get the live stream access, which we just did earlier today. So you can go hear all our thoughts about all sorts of other stuff. Discord access as well if you want to chat to us, and yeah, subscribe for the upcoming parts as well. Part 3 on the Patreon questions. So I think that's pretty much going to do it for this one. Yeah,
I can't think of anything else to say for once. So I think we'll just say, all right, Tim. All right. I think we'll just say
burning you hard at the end of this episode. I probably won't get out of this one alive, so better just cut the feed. We're done. We're done on this one.
I love how your cheekiness factor went up quite a lot when we had to social distance.
Well, you can't hit me in person, can
you? Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim. See you
again next time.
In the next one.